November the 1st, 1929, Leola, Pennsylvania. Raymond Elmer DeWalt walks into the main office of the DeWalt Products Company. The air outside is freezing. The atmosphere inside is worse. 4 days earlier, the Wall Street stock market collapsed, wiping out $30 billion in wealth in less than 96 hours. Raymond looks at his order books. They are empty. The construction companies that had been begging for his machinery a week ago are canceling contracts by the hour. He is 43 years old. He has spent the last 7 years building a manufacturing facility from a dirt floor workshop into an operation that serves 40 states. Now he is looking at a piece of paper that says he might lose everything before the winter ends. It will become the most brutal survival test in the history of American woodworking machinery. And Raymond has to make a choice that will either save his workers or destroy his name. This wasn't just another small-town woodworker who got lucky with a patent. Raymond DeWalt was the man who looked at a 5,000-year-old trade and realized that humans were doing all the heavy lifting while the machines just sat there. He built a machine so revolutionary that a single operator could do the work of 6 men with absolute precision. He would build an industrial empire that would survive the Great Depression, power the factories of World War II, and place a tool in nearly every workshop in the Western world. And then he would watch his own board of directors sell the company out from under him, leaving him to watch his name become a corporate color scheme rather than a standard of engineering. This is the story of how one man's obsession with eliminating wasted human movement created the modern construction site, and why that very success made him vulnerable to the financiers who eventually pushed him out. From a Pennsylvania farm to a rowdy logging sawmill, to a global manufacturing powerhouse, to the moment corporate raiders realized the name on the metal was worth more than the man who forged it. But here's what nobody talks about. Raymond DeWalt did not invent his famous saw to get rich. He invented it because he was terrified of what was happening to the hands of his men. He watched his workers lose fingers, wrists, and livelihoods to the dangerous, unpredictable tools of the early 20th century. He knew that if he did not change how wood was cut, the industry would keep breaking the bodies of the people who built America. And he refused to let that happen, even if it meant fighting the entire machine tool establishment to prove his point. Raymond Elmer DeWalt, 31 years old, a tall man with thick hands and a quiet, intense gaze that made lazy men nervous, arrived in Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1918. He was the son of a Pennsylvania farmer, and he had spent his youth learning that the earth does not give up anything without a struggle. He had no formal engineering degree. He had no wealthy backers. He had a wife, 3 children, and a reputation for fixing broken operations that other managers abandoned. The general manager of the Seabrook Shipbuilding Corporation had hired him to run a woodworking mill that was supposed to produce timber for government cargo ships. The war in Europe was raging, and the government needed hulls in the water immediately. The world Raymond walked into was loud, wet, and dangerously slow. Sawmills in the early 20th century were meat grinders. The technology of the day relied on heavy, stationary tables with a spinning blade protruding from the center. To cut a massive beam of oak or pine, 2 or 3 men had to physically push the heavy timber against the spinning blade. If the wood warped, or if it hit a knot in the grain, the blade would kick back. A piece of wood flying at 80 miles an hour could pierce a man's chest instantly. If a worker slipped on the wet sawdust covering the floor, their hands went straight into the steel. Raymond hated inefficiency more than he hated danger. He stood in the center of the Fredericksburg mill every morning at 6 o'clock, watching his 40-man crew struggle with a mountain of oak timbers. He noticed that the men spent half their day just turning the heavy logs around so they could make different kinds of cuts. They were exhausting themselves before noon just doing the work of oxen. Raymond realized that the industry was looking at the problem backward. They were trying to move the heavy material against a fixed tool when they should have been moving a lightweight tool against a fixed piece of material. He started sketching designs on the back of shipping manifests in his office after the men went home at 5:30 in the evening. He trusted only one man with his thoughts, a master machinist named Forrest Bennett, 41 years old, who had spent 20 years turning raw iron into precision parts. Raymond told Bennett that they needed to lift the saw blade into the air, suspend it over the table, and let it slide along a guide rail. Bennett told him it was impossible because the weight of the motor would cause the arm to sag, ruining the precision of the cut. Raymond refused to accept the answer. He spent 3 months calculating the tensile strength of cast iron arms. He designed a yoke that could rotate 360 degrees, allowing the blade to cut at any angle while the wood stayed completely still. By the spring of 1922, they had a working prototype. It looked like a mechanical crane with a motor bolted to its wrist. He bolted it to a heavy wooden bench in the corner of the mill, turned on the electric current, and pulled the blade through an oak timber with one hand. The cut was perfect. The wood didn't move an inch. Raymond knew he had just made every saw table in the world obsolete. But that is what forced him into his next gamble. The war had ended, the shipbuilding contracts vanished, and Raymond was out of a job. He took his prototype, packed his family into a used Ford, and moved back to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He had less than $300 in savings. He rented a small, unheated workspace in Leola, and on a Tuesday in 1924, he organized the DeWalt Products Company. To understand why this breakthrough changed everything, you have to understand the five-step reality of what Raymond had actually done. First, the opportunity. In the early 1900s, construction was booming across the United States, but every single board used to frame a house had to be cut by hand on site, or shipped from a distant mill that could only make straight cuts. There was no portable machine that could perform cross-cutting, mitering, and ripping at the actual building location. Second, the insight. Raymond understood that by mounting a circular saw directly to a yoke that slid along a horizontal overhead arm, the operator could change the angle of the tool instead of changing the position of the wood. The machine would bear the weight of the motor, leaving the human being free to focus entirely on accuracy. Third, the execution. He manufactured the overhead arm from high-grade cast iron, machining the guide tracks to a tolerance of less than 1/1000th of an inch. He designed an electric motor that was exceptionally flat on the bottom, which allowed the blade to drop lower and utilize its full diameter for deep cuts. He called the finished machine the DeWalt Wonderworker. Fourth, the result. Before the Wonderworker, a skilled carpenter required 4 minutes to mark and hand saw a compound angle on a heavy rafter. Raymond's machine performed the exact same cut in 6 seconds. In a single day, one operator using the DeWalt saw could process enough lumber to frame 3 entire houses. That was a production increase of over 3,000% per worker. Fifth, the problem it created. The machine was so efficient and durable that construction companies only needed to buy one of them every 15 years. Raymond had built a product that was too good for a standard replacement cycle. To grow his business, he had to constantly find new markets, which meant he needed a massive sales force and large amounts of capital to finance production before the orders were paid for. Here is where it gets interesting. By 1927, the Wonderworker was everywhere. Raymond had expanded the factory to 60 workers, and he was shipping machines to Canada, Cuba, and Great Britain. He moved his family into a large stone house in Lancaster, but his daily routine never changed. He arrived at the factory at 5 a.m., walked the assembly line to inspect the bearings, and kept a notebook in his pocket where he recorded every suggestion his salesman brought back from the field. He was 41 years old, and he was the undisputed king of the radial arm saw. Then, the floor fell out from under the American economy. The Great Depression hit the construction industry like a sledgehammer. By 1932, home building in the United States had dropped by 92%. The companies that bought Raymond's saws were going bankrupt by the thousands. DeWalt Products Company went from shipping hundreds of machines a week to struggling to sell 10. Raymond's board of directors, terrified of losing their personal investments, demanded that he shut down the factory, lay off the entire workforce, and wait out the economic storm in total stagnation. Raymond refused. He knew that if he closed the doors, his machinists would starve, and their skills would leave Lancaster forever. He called a meeting of his remaining 40 workers on a Friday afternoon in November. He looked them in the eye and told them that if they stayed, he would keep paying them, but they wouldn't be building saws. They would be building whatever the community needed to survive. He pivoted his entire manufacturing operation to produce small, cheap utility items. His precision machinists spent their days forging garden tools, metal clothesline posts, and small kitchen brackets. Raymond took a 60% pay cut himself. He spent his nights driving through rural Pennsylvania, trading small workshop tools to farmers in exchange for ham, potatoes, and firewood, which he brought back to the factory and distributed to his employees. For 3 long years, the DeWalt empire survived on barter and grit. What happened next shocked everyone who knew him. By 1935, the economy began to breathe again. The federal government launched the Works Progress Administration, pouring millions of dollars into public building projects. Suddenly, every contractor in the country needed radial arm saws to build schools, dams, and post offices. Because Raymond had kept his factory alive and his workforce intact, DeWalt was the only manufacturer capable of meeting the demand instantly. Orders flooded into Leola. The factory went to 24-hour shifts. Raymond had not only survived the greatest economic collapse in human history, he had emerged from it with zero debt and absolute dominance of the market. By 1938, the company had outgrown the small Leola workshop. Raymond moved the entire operation to a modern 15-acre facility in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The new plant employed 300 people and generated over $2 million in annual revenue. The brand had become bigger than the man. When a carpenter said the word DeWalt, they didn't think of Raymond Elmer DeWalt, the farmer's son. They thought of the heavy gray iron machine that stood in the center of their workshop, humming with a sound that meant precision and power. Raymond remained a human heart inside that corporate machine. Every single employee who completed 5 years of service received a gold watch delivered personally by Raymond during a private lunch in his office. He knew the names of his workers' children. He established a company baseball team and paid for the uniforms himself. He bought medical insurance for his workers decades before it became a standard corporate practice. He trusted his men, and they trusted him. Then came the year 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into World War II. The War Department immediately took control of all industrial manufacturing in the country. They issued a directive to the DeWalt factory: stop all civilian sales. Every single saw produced in Lancaster was now property of the United States military. The company faced its greatest production challenge. The Army needed portable sawmills that could be dropped into the jungles of the Pacific or the mud of Western Europe to build airfields, barracks, and bridges. Raymond had to redesign his heavy cast iron machine into a lightweight, rugged version that could survive being thrown out of an airplane or bolted to the back of a moving truck. He developed the DeWalt Model GP, a radial arm saw built from high-tensile aluminum alloys instead of heavy cast iron. It weighed less than half of the original design but retained every ounce of its precision. The military ordered 10,000 units in the first batch alone. Raymond's factory was now running 3 shifts, 7 days a week, employing 700 workers, including hundreds of women who stepped into the machining roles left vacant by men fighting overseas. On July 14, 1944, the War Department awarded the DeWalt factory the Army-Navy E Award for outstanding achievement in the production of war materials. It was the highest civilian honor a manufacturer could receive. Raymond stood on a wooden platform outside his factory, looking out at his 700 workers who were cheering under a hot July sun. He was 57 years old. He had reached the absolute peak of industrial success. His company was worth millions, his product had helped win a global war, and his name was synonymous with the physical building of the modern world. And this is the detail that nobody in the history books mentions. Raymond DeWalt was exhausted. The pressure of wartime production, the endless fight with government bureaucrats over material allocations, and the loss of several close friends in the war had broken his health. He began to suffer from severe fatigue and heart palpitations. His doctor told him that if he did not step away from the daily operations of the factory, he would not live to see 60. Raymond looked at his family. He looked at his legacy. He wanted to spend his remaining years returning to his first love, practical invention, without the crushing weight of managing an international corporation with hundreds of employees and volatile quarterly margins. He stepped down as president of DeWalt Products Company and sold his controlling interest to a group of external investors for a sum exceeding $3 million. He believed he was buying his freedom. In reality, he had just opened the gates to the people who would erase him from his own empire. The new owners were not toolmakers. They were financiers from New York who looked at the DeWalt factory and saw an undervalued asset that could be polished up and sold for a quick profit. They immediately changed the name from the DeWalt Products Company to DeWalt Incorporated. They began cutting costs, reducing the tolerances on the machining tracks from 1/1000th of an inch to 5/1000th of an inch, to speed up assembly. They stopped the gold wash tradition. They treated the factory workers as line items on a spreadsheet rather than partners in a craft. Raymond watched from his home in Lancaster as the culture he built was systematically dismantled. He tried to intervene, using his seat on the advisory board to protest the decline in quality, but the new management ignored him. He was a minority shareholder now. He was an old man with old-fashioned ideas about worker loyalty and over-engineered steel. They told him his services were no longer required on the factory floor. In 1949, the investment group pulled off the ultimate flip. They sold DeWalt Incorporated to the American Machine and Foundry Company, a massive corporate conglomerate known as AMF. The acquisition was strictly a play to diversify AMF's portfolio. The people running the conglomerate didn't know the difference between a rip cut and a cross cut. They only cared that the DeWalt name still carried immense trust among professionals, and they intended to exploit that trust to the absolute limit. AMF executives realized that the professional market for massive radial arm saws was nearing saturation. To keep their stock price rising, they needed to enter the rapidly growing post-war suburban consumer market. Millions of young men were returning from the war, buying homes in the suburbs under the GI Bill, and setting up workshops in their basements. They didn't need a 1,200-pound cast-iron machine that cost a year's wages. They needed a small, cheap saw they could plug into a standard wall outlet. In 1953, AMF launched the DeWalt Power Shop. It was a scaled-down, lightweight radial arm saw targeted directly at the suburban hobbyist. The advertising campaign featured pristine suburban fathers in pressed trousers using the machine to build birdhouses and spice racks in clean, brightly lit garages. The tool was an instant commercial success, selling 50,000 units in its first 2 years. But that success came at a terrible price. To hit the $99 retail price point that suburban homeowners could afford, AMF had to strip out the premium materials that made Raymond's original machines legendary. They replaced machined steel tracks with stamped sheet metal. They used cheaper bearings that wore out after 200 hours of use. They reduced the copper windings in the motors, causing them to overheat if pushed through thick oak or maple. Raymond DeWalt could not bear to watch it. He resigned his remaining honorary position on the board. He retired to his private workshop, a small stone outbuilding on his property, where he shut the door and returned to manual work. He spent his final years developing small, quirky inventions that had nothing to do with the corporate machine that bore his name. He designed specialized joining clips, unique storage racks, and basic hand tools. He never allowed an AMF-era DeWalt tool into his shop. He used the original, heavy cast-iron Wonderworker he had machined with his own hands in 1924. On May 8, 1957, Raymond Elmer DeWalt died at his home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was 70 years old. The local newspaper ran a short obituary on page 12, calling him a prominent retired manufacturer. The executives at AMF did not attend the funeral. They were in the middle of negotiating a new licensing agreement to expand the brand into international markets. The man was gone, but the name was just getting started. In 1960, AMF sold DeWalt to Black & Decker, the undisputed giant of the consumer power tool market. Black & Decker bought the brand for one specific reason: to kill their competition. They already had a line of consumer saws, and they didn't want the DeWalt name competing for the same suburban garage space. Over the next 3 decades, Black & Decker systematically shrank the radial arm saw business, eventually discontinuing the consumer line entirely and leaving the DeWalt name to languish on a small selection of specialized industrial machines. By 1989, the DeWalt brand was practically dead. It represented less than 1% of Black & Decker's total corporate revenue. The name that had once defined the cutting edge of American construction was reduced to a historical footnote, an old tool found in the back of grandfathers' garages, covered in rust and grease. But the story of Raymond's name has one final, ironic twist. In 1992, Black & Decker found itself losing the professional contractor market to a Japanese competitor named Makita. Professional carpenters and electric workers refused to buy Black & Decker tools because they associated the brand with cheap plastic drills that broke after a month on a real job site. Black & Decker needed a way to tell professionals that they were serious about industrial quality. Instead of engineering a completely new line of tools from scratch, corporate executives made a marketing decision. They took their existing heavy-duty professional tools, housed them in high-impact industrial yellow casings, and stamped the old DeWalt logo across the side. They launched a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign resurrecting the image of the rugged, indestructible American job site. The strategy worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Within 5 years, the yellow and black DeWalt tools became the dominant force on every commercial construction project in North America. By 2026, the DeWalt brand generated billions of dollars in annual revenue, producing hundreds of different cordless drills, grinders, and impact drivers shipped to every corner of the earth. Raymond Elmer DeWalt paid for his first workshop with his personal savings in 1924. Black & Decker built a multi-billion-dollar empire on the reputation that survived inside that single name. On paper, it is one of the most successful brand revivals in corporate history. In practice, it is an illusion. The yellow plastic drills spinning on modern construction sites tonight have no engineering connection to the cast iron arms machined in Lancaster County 90 years ago. The modern corporation kept the name because the name represents an era of uncompromising human dedication that the corporation itself could never reproduce. Somewhere in America tonight, in a cold barn or an old commercial cabinet shop on the edge of town, an old carpenter is wiping the dust off a gray cast-iron DeWalt radial arm saw. Built in 1942, he flips the heavy toggle switch. The massive motor hums to life with a deep, vibration-free growl that sounds exactly like the factory floor in Leola did during the war. The saw is 84 years old. It weighs more than the man using it. The cast-iron arm has not sagged a single fraction of an inch. It still cuts to the exact thousandth of accuracy that Raymond demanded from his machinists before he let them ship it out the door. That machine is the true monument to the man who refused to let his workers break their hands against the wood. The rest is just yellow plastic. If this story found you, there are more like it on this channel. We cover the machines, the tools, and the people who built the physical world. Subscribe, and we will bring you a new one every week. Drop a comment below. Was Raymond DeWalt right to sell his company to save his health, or did he make a fatal mistake by letting the financiers control his name? Drop your take below.